At 35,000 feet above the clouds, inside the quiet luxury of first class, arrogance met its match. On Aurora Airlines Flight 781, Billionaire CEO Richard Hawthorne reclined in seat 2, a champagne in hand, ego sky-high, convinced he owned the air itself. Then came Danielle Carter, a young black flight attendant, who asked him calmly to fasten his seatbelt before turbulence. He sneered, "People like me don't take orders from people like you." And then, a slap. The sound cracked through the cabin like lightning. Every passenger froze. Cameras rose. The world would soon see what happens when wealth, racism, and power collide in the sky. Because in that moment, Richard Hawthorne wasn't a billionaire. He was a man about to lose everything. When arrogance meets dignity, there's only one way it ends, and justice always finds its flight path. But who were they? This billionaire who thought he owned the skies, and the flight attendant whose quiet strength would bring him down. Let's dive into their worlds and see how two lives on opposite ends of power were destined to collide. Richard Hawthorne wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of man whose name opened doors before he even knocked. He had built an empire from the ground up, or so the magazines said. But behind the glossy headlines of self-made success lay another truth: connections, privilege, and the invisible scaffolding of a system that gave men like him a head start while leaving others behind. By the age of 45, Richard had amassed a net worth that climbed into the billions. His company dominated industries from luxury hotels to high-tech investments. But the power came with something darker, an arrogance carved into his very being. Richard wasn't just confident, he was dismissive. Dismissive of waiters, of drivers, of hotel clerks, and more often than not, dismissive of anyone who didn't look like him. His world was a fortress of polished glass towers and marble lobbies, designed to shield him from the realities most people lived every day. Stories circulated quietly among hotel staff and flight crews. He was known for berating receptionists, demanding upgrades that weren't available, barking at flight attendants as if they were personal servants. Most endured his tantrums in silence, because who dared challenge a billionaire? A complaint against a man like Richard was a career risk. Wealth bought silence, and silence bred impunity. This cycle of arrogance and immunity had carried Richard for years. In his mind, he was invincible. For him, first class wasn't just a seat, it was a stage, a reminder that he was among the elite, while others belonged behind the curtain. He boarded Aurora Airlines Flight 781 with the same swagger he carried into every room. Chin lifted, eyes narrowed, convinced the rules of ordinary people stopped at his feet. What he didn't know was that this flight would expose him to the very truth he had long ignored, that no amount of money, power, or entitlement could protect a man from the consequences of his own actions. While Richard Hawthorne's world was built on privilege, Danielle Carter's was shaped by resilience. Born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, Danielle was the youngest of 3 siblings. Her mother, a school teacher, and her father, a postal worker, had always instilled in her the values of hard work, dignity, and education. The Carters were not wealthy, but their home was rich with love, discipline, and the unshakable belief that character mattered more than circumstance. Danielle's childhood wasn't easy. She grew up in a neighborhood where opportunity felt like a locked door, where schools were underfunded and expectations low. But Danielle refused to be defined by what society whispered about kids from her side of town. She excelled academically, driven not just by ambition but by a quiet determination to prove that Black girls could rise beyond the stereotypes placed on them. Yet, even as she worked harder than her peers, she felt the weight of racism pressing against her path. Teachers questioned whether her grades were earned or lucky. Store clerks followed her around aisles. Job interviews ended with polite rejections once her face walked into the room. These small cuts of prejudice left scars, but they also sharpened her resolve. By the time she graduated college, Danielle had learned to wear her dignity like armor. She understood that in a world quick to underestimate her, composure was not just survival, it was defiance. Choosing a career as a flight attendant was no accident. Travel gave her a sense of freedom, a possibility. Every time she stepped onto a plane, she carried not just her uniform, but the silent prayers of her parents, who reminded her, hold your head high, no matter where you go. But the skies weren't free from the turbulence of racism. Danielle had dealt with passengers who refused to be served by her, who spoke to her as though she were invisible, who saw the color of her skin before the humanity in her eyes. For Danielle, every flight was more than a job. It was a quiet battle to assert her humanity in a world that too often tried to deny it. Every smile she offered, every act of professionalism, was both service and resistance. Her colleagues admired her grace. They noticed how she never lost her temper, how she stood firm against microaggressions that would have broken others. Some even called her the anchor, because she had a way of steadying not just herself, but those around her. What none of the passengers on Flight 781 knew was that Danielle was carrying more than her uniform that day. She was carrying generations of struggle, of ancestors who had endured chains, segregation, and systemic injustice, yet survived with their heads held high. She was the living embodiment of survival turned into strength. And while Richard Hawthorne saw her only as a service worker to be dismissed, she knew exactly who she was, the daughter of a community that had fought for every inch of dignity it was allowed. Airplanes are strange places. At 35,000 feet, the powerful and the powerless share the same sky, sealed into a tube of metal where social hierarchies blur and yet at the same time sharpen. The man in the tailored suit and the woman in the uniform might cross paths nowhere else in life, but in first class, their worlds sit inches apart. On Aurora Airlines Flight 781, the tension of that strange proximity was about to erupt. Richard Hawthorne entered the cabin as if he owned it. His black leather shoes tapped against the carpet with the authority of someone who had never been told no. A personal assistant trailed behind him, carrying his coat, phone, and briefcase, while Richard barked orders into his Bluetooth headset. He barely acknowledged the flight attendants who greeted him with practiced smiles. To him, they weren't people, just part of the furniture of his luxury. Danielle Carter, meanwhile, was already in motion. Professional, composed, and attentive, she checked seatbelts, stowed luggage, and answered questions with her usual calm poise. She noticed Richard immediately, not because of his fame, but because of his energy. Arrogance radiated from him like heat. She had seen passengers like him before, entitled, impatient, convinced that the rules of the sky applied to everyone except them. But something about Richard was sharper, meaner. The way his eyes flicked over her and dismissed her instantly told Danielle everything she needed to know. He saw her skin, her uniform, and made his judgment. She was beneath him. The two worlds, his of unchecked privilege, hers of hard-earned dignity, were set on a collision course. And in the sealed cabin of Flight 781, there was no escape. The signs began early. Richard refused to put his phone away during takeoff, ignoring the safety briefing. When Danielle approached to remind him gently, he waved his hand as though swatting away a fly. Passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing his hostility. Later, when turbulence was forecast, Danielle walked the aisles reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Most complied without hesitation, but Richard leaned back, spread his arms arrogantly across the seat, and smirked. "You think I'm afraid of a little bump in the air?" He sneered, loud enough for others to hear. Danielle didn't flinch. She simply repeated the instruction, her voice calm but firm. This was her training, her strength, never to meet hostility with hostility. Yet behind her professionalism, she could feel the sting of his tone. It wasn't just defiance, it was defiance aimed at her. Other passengers began recording. Phones lifted discreetly. These days, everyone knew that arrogance in public often ended up on the internet. And still, Richard didn't notice, or didn't care. He was untouchable, wasn't he? What Richard didn't know was that Danielle had faced worse than him before. She had endured customers who mocked her accent, men who spoke down to her because of her gender, and passengers who asked to be served by someone else. Each time she had stood tall, Each time she had chosen dignity over despair. The air in first class felt charged. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered, others stared, waiting to see how far the situation would go. It was as though everyone could sense the storm building in the narrow aisle. And then came the spark. Danielle leaned down once more, her voice even but unyielding, reminding Richard of the seatbelt rule. Her words were not a challenge, not a confrontation, but a simple adherence to protocol. But to Richard Hawthorne, being told what to do, especially by a black woman, was an unforgivable insult. He narrowed his eyes, smirked, and spoke words that dripped with venom. People like me don't take orders from people like you. Gas filled the cabin. Phones clicked record. The moment had arrived. The worlds of arrogance and dignity had collided, and the impact would be seismic. Danielle Carter stood steady, her hand resting lightly on the back of a seat as she reminded Richard again, calm, professional, unwavering, that he needed to fasten his seatbelt. She had said these words 1,000 times to 1,000 passengers, but in this moment they carried the weight of defiance. Richard leaned forward, his face twisted with contempt. His voice cut through the quiet cabin. Do you know who I am? Do you know how much money I make in a single hour compared to your salary in a year? Danielle didn't answer. She refused to feed his arrogance with reaction, and that silence enraged him more than any words could have. The other passengers froze. Some lowered their eyes, hoping not to be dragged into the storm. Others, phones in hand, held them steady, cameras recording. And then it happened. Richard's hand shot up with sudden violence, and in a single motion, he struck Danielle across the face. The sound of the slap cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Danielle staggered back a step, her cheek burning red. For a moment, she gripped the armrest beside her, steadying herself. She did not cry. She did not lash back. She simply stood there, shoulders squared, eyes burning not with rage, but with an almost unshakable calm. The cabin fell into stunned silence. Champagne glasses trembled on tray tables. A mother pulled her child closer. Every passenger seemed frozen in disbelief, staring at the billionaire who had just done the unthinkable. And then, one voice broke the silence. "You're done, man," said a passenger in seat 3C. His voice was low, steady, full of disgust. "You don't come back from this." Richard sneered, adjusting his cufflinks as though brushing off the moment. He looked around at the wide eyes and raised phones and said with chilling arrogance, "Record all you want. None of this will matter. I can buy every one of you if I have to." But he was wrong, because in that moment, the power had shifted. For years, Richard's wealth had shielded him from consequence. But cameras don't care about money. They capture truth, raw and unfiltered. And the truth was undeniable. A billionaire CEO had assaulted a black flight attendant in front of dozens of witnesses. Danielle lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the sting on her cheek. "Sir, you have assaulted a crew member. By law, this will be reported to the captain immediately." Her professionalism only deepened the shame of his act. She hadn't crumbled. She hadn't raised her voice. She had met his violence with composure that outshone every ounce of his wealth. The passengers erupted, some with outrage, others with support. A woman in the back shouted, "We're with you!" Another man leaned across the aisle, glaring at Richard. "You think money's going to save you? Not this time." Richard's smirk faltered. For the first time, he sensed something he had never felt before, the weight of public disapproval pressing down on him. And behind it, something even more dangerous, the viral eye of the internet, watching. But still, he tried to laugh it off. He leaned back, waving a dismissive hand, as though everyone would soon forget. Yet the truth was clear. They wouldn't forget. Not the passengers, not the airline, not the millions who would soon watch the video online. Danielle straightened, touched her cheek briefly, then walked calmly toward the front of the cabin to alert the captain. Every step she took was a declaration. She would not be broken. And behind her, in seat 2A, Richard Hawthorne shifted uncomfortably for the first time. The slap had been heard, and soon it would echo across the world. Danielle stood at the front of the cabin, her cheeks still throbbing where Richard's hand had struck her. The sting was real, but deeper than that was the weight of centuries, of a long history in which black women had been disrespected, silenced, and forced to endure indignities with no recourse. But Danielle was not silent, and she was not broken. She lifted the intercom phone, her voice calm and steady, announcing to the captain what had happened. Passenger in seat 2A has assaulted a crew member, requesting immediate action upon landing. Her words were measured, precise. There was no trace of emotion, just professionalism. Passengers listened in awe. To them, Danielle's composure was staggering. She had just been humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers. Yet she stood taller than ever, her presence commanding more respect than the billionaire who had tried to belittle her. Richard, however, was unraveling. He leaned back in his seat, scoffing, his voice booming across the cabin as though volume could erase guilt. "This is ridiculous. Do you people know who I am? I practically bankroll half the politicians in Washington. You think some stewardess," he spat the word with venom, "can ruin me?" The arrogance, the racism, the entitlement, it was all spilling out unchecked. But where Richard saw intimidation, others saw desperation. He was a man lashing out, trying to cling to the illusion that his power still meant something. Danielle, ignoring his rant, moved down the aisle to check on other passengers. Her voice was gentle, asking if anyone needed water, if the turbulence made anyone uncomfortable. She continued her duties as though nothing had happened, her dignity untouchable. And that composure drove Richard into a deeper fury. "Don't you dare ignore me," he shouted. "I'll have your job by tomorrow morning." But his threats landed hollow, because passengers were no longer intimidated by his wealth. They had seen too much, heard too much, and they had the proof, video after video, recording his every word, every insult, every act of violence. A woman in seat 4B spoke up, her voice sharp. "You think your money gives you the right to hit people? To disrespect her like that?" "We all saw what you did," another man added. "She's handling herself with more class than you've shown in your entire life." The cabin murmured in agreement. The tide had turned. Richard was no longer the man commanding respect. He was the man everyone despised. Danielle's fellow crew members gathered quietly around her. One placed a hand on her shoulder in silent support. Another whispered, "We're with you." And she nodded, continuing to do her work with the same quiet strength she had always carried. Her calm became a mirror, reflecting Richard's rage back at him. The more composed she was, the smaller he appeared. He had wealth, but she had dignity. He had power, but she had respect. And in that enclosed cabin, respect mattered far more. For Danielle, this wasn't just about herself. It was about every black woman who had been dismissed, disrespected, and mistreated. And passengers could feel it. The cabin seemed to hum with unspoken solidarity. People leaned toward Danielle, offering nods, quiet words of support. A young black girl sitting with her mother whispered, "She's so brave," and her mother squeezed her hand. Meanwhile, Richard sat isolated. The power he thought he owned had evaporated. His threats sounded empty, his arrogance laughable. He was a man stripped bare, exposed for what he truly was, not untouchable, not superior, but small. Danielle's calm had done what no courtroom or boardroom ever had. It had reduced Richard Hawthorne from a titan to a tantrum. And yet Danielle knew this was only the beginning. Because when the plane touched the ground, the real storm would come. A man in his 50s, seated across the aisle, said, calmly but firm, "You crossed a line, sir. You don't get to put your hands on her. Not now, not ever." Richard turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this. You don't know who you're talking to." But the man didn't back down. He folded his arms and said, "We all saw who you are." The words lingered in the cabin. We all saw. And they weren't just words. They were literal. Phones were raised, cameras were recording. Truth was being documented in real time. A woman in seat 1C leaned forward, her voice trembling with anger. My father marched with Dr. King. He didn't do that, so men like you could still think you're above treating people with respect. Another passenger, a young mother with her child on her lap, added, My daughter just watched you hit a woman for doing her job. Do you realize what you just taught her? That money excuses violence? Her words cut deeper than any accusation of lawbreaking. They struck at Richard's image, the legacy he believed he was building. Richard scoffed, raising his voice louder. You're all exaggerating. She provoked me. She disrespected me in front of everyone. But the passengers weren't buying it. A younger man pulled down his headphones and shook his head. Disrespected you? She asked you to put on a seatbelt, man. You slapped her because you couldn't handle hearing no. That's not disrespect. That's weakness. The cabin hummed with approval. Murmurs turned into agreement, nods into declarations. What had been an isolated confrontation was becoming a collective stand. Danielle, still calm, walked back down the aisle, checking on passengers as though it were any ordinary flight. Her cheeks still bore the red mark, but her dignity shone brighter. And as she passed, passengers reached out, some squeezing her hand, others whispering, We're with you. Richard, meanwhile, began to feel the weight of isolation. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. He had walked into the cabin believing he owned it. Now he sat surrounded by eyes filled with judgment, disdain, even disgust. A passenger in the back finally said what everyone was thinking. Money doesn't buy you respect. It just bought you the front row seat to your own downfall. The cabin erupted with quiet laughs and murmurs of agreement. For the first time, Richard's armor of arrogance cracked. His usual weapon, fear, was useless. The crowd wasn't afraid. They were united. And it was more than just outrage at a slap. This was bigger. Passengers recognized the layers of injustice at play. A wealthy white CEO had struck a black woman for daring to enforce the same rules that applied to everyone. It wasn't just arrogance. It was the age-old sickness of racism rearing its head in the confined space of an airplane cabin. One older black man stood up, his voice steady with lived experience. I've been stopped, searched, humiliated, and ignored my whole life. Men like you always think the rules don't apply to you, and women like her always pay the price. Not today. Not this time. By now, nearly every phone in the cabin was recording. Richard was no longer a CEO in control. He was the villain in a viral video, a man exposed in the raw glare of truth. And even he was beginning to realize it. For years, silence had protected him, but on Flight 781, silence broke. Passengers stood together, voices woven into one chorus. Enough was enough. And that chorus was louder, stronger, and more powerful than any billionaire's name could ever be. The hum of the engines was steady, almost mocking, as Flight 781 descended through the night sky. For the passengers, the atmosphere carried a strange duality, calm on the surface, but beneath it, the quiet storm of anticipation. Everyone knew this flight was no longer just about getting from point A to point B. It was a story unfolding, one that would not end when the wheels touched the tarmac. The slap had been quick, impulsive, a flash of entitlement, but its consequences were stretching endlessly, woven into every whispered conversation, every smartphone video uploading in real time to the cloud. Richard might not have known it yet, but by the time his jet black loafers touched the airport floor, his empire would already be unraveling. The captain's voice finally broke the tension over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our final descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened, tray tables stowed, and electronic devices set to airplane mode. The usual announcement carried unusual weight. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. For the first time in the flight, it wasn't the turbulence they were bracing for. It was the aftermath. Richard shifted uncomfortably, snapping his fingers at a flight attendant as if demanding reassurance. When we land, I want a car waiting. I'll handle this privately. His voice cracked, betraying his fear. But the young attendant, standing beside Danielle, met his gaze with steady eyes. When we land, the authorities will be waiting. This isn't something money can make disappear. The words hit Richard harder than the dissent. He turned away, muttering, his face pale beneath the cabin lights. Out the windows, the city glimmered like 1,000 watchful eyes. Runway lights stretched like an unbroken path of truth, guiding the aircraft toward a reckoning. The plane dipped lower, and the passengers leaned forward with it, feeling not just the pull of dissent, but of justice inching closer. Danielle took a deep breath at the front of the cabin, her hands folded before her. She had lived her life knowing that as a Black woman, dignity was often tested, questioned, and dismissed. Yet tonight she had stood firm. She hadn't raised her voice or her hand. She had simply refused to let disrespect define her. And that quiet defiance had turned into a force larger than any billionaire's wallet. As the landing gear extended with a dull thud, Richard whispered into his phone, shielding the screen. He was calling his lawyers, no doubt, trying to spin the narrative before the wheels even touched down. But no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the videos now circulating online, spreading faster than his lawyers could type cease and desist letters. The passengers knew it. They watched him fidget and curse under his breath, and the knowledge brought them a grim satisfaction. This man who had once thrived on intimidation was now reduced to a cornered figure, waiting for the consequences he had spent a lifetime dodging. The cabin lights flickered as the plane touched down, tires screeching against the asphalt. The moment was ordinary in every way except one. For Richard, it was the beginning of an extraordinary fall. As the engines roared in reverse thrust, Danielle braced herself, not for the landing, but for the next chapter. For her, the ground below held not just consequences for Richard, but the possibility of change, however small, in a world where too many still believe wealth excuse violence. And in that moment, with the plane slowing on the runway, a truth was clear. Richard Sterling's power ended at the cabin door. On the ground, he would be just another man facing the law. By the time the jet engines whined down and the plane rolled to a slow crawl on the tarmac, the world already knew. Passengers had wasted no time uploading the footage. Within minutes of the slap, video clips were circulating across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The images were raw. A wealthy white CEO, veins bulging in rage, striking a young Black flight attendant who refused to bend the rules for him. The camera phones had captured it all. The arrogance in his tone, the defiance in her silence, the ripple of passengers rallying to her side. What made the footage even more powerful was Danielle's response. In every clip, she stood tall, composed, unbroken. No yelling, no retaliation, just calm dignity. She became the anchor of the story, while Richard Sterling became its villain. By the time the plane reached the gate, hashtags were already trending. #justice for Danielle, #Sterling slap, #dignity in the sky. The internet, ruthless in its memory, dredged up Richard's history. Old lawsuits resurfaced, past complaints from employees about toxic work culture were shared. Even whispers of racial bias in his company hiring practices. The slap had become more than a single act. It was the tipping point in a long pattern of arrogance, wealth, and impunity. Inside the cabin, passengers were watching the story unfold in real time. Those who had uploaded the videos showed each other their screens. Retweets climbing by the second, millions of views stacking up like an unstoppable wave. One young man leaned over to Danielle and whispered, "You're already a hero. People are calling you a symbol of grace under fire." Danielle shook her head gently. "I'm no hero. I was just doing my job." But that humility only deepened the public's respect for her. Heroes aren't always those who fight with fists. They are those who endure with strength, refusing to be broken by injustice. Meanwhile, Richard tried desperately to spin control. He barked into his phone, "Get ahead of this. Draft a statement. Say she exaggerated. Say the footage doesn't show the full story." But no crafted press release could undo the raw clarity of a video watched by millions. The public wasn't waiting for his explanation. They had already judged. The sight of his hand striking Danielle's face spoke louder than any words could. News outlets picked up the story almost instantly. Breaking news banners flashed across screens. Billionaire CEO assaults flight attendant in first class. Talk shows debated the deeper issues of power, race, and accountability. Activists weighed in, calling for justice, not just for Danielle, but for every worker who had ever endured mistreatment at the hands of those who believed money excused cruelty. On the plane, the murmurs grew. Passengers whispered updates to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief at how fast the story had spread. "It's everywhere," one woman gasped, scrolling her phone. "He's finished." For Richard, the reality sank in like lead. His empire had been built on the illusion of control, on buying silence and bending narratives. But this time, truth was outpacing him. This time, he wasn't the author of the story. He was the villain, and the world was writing his downfall. Danielle, however, felt the weight of attention pressing in. She hadn't sought the spotlight, hadn't wanted to be a symbol. She had simply wanted to finish her shift, to land safely, to go home. Yet now she was being thrust into a larger battle, one that was about more than her. It was about the value of Black lives, the dignity of women in the workplace, the myth of untouchable power. The plane finally stopped at the gate. Seatbelts clicked open, and passengers prepared to disembark. But no one moved toward the aisle. Everyone knew the authorities would board first, and everyone knew the world was already watching. The slap had been seconds long. The storm it unleashed would last for years. The chime rang, and the cabin doors swung open with a hiss. Normally, this was the moment of relief, when passengers stretched, gathered bags, and prepared to rejoin the world. But on Flight 781, no one moved. All eyes turned toward the front, waiting. The first figures through the door were not airport staff or cleaners. They were uniformed officers, calm, deliberate, and unmistakably official. Their boots clicked against the aircraft floor as they stepped in with measured authority. The sight alone silenced even the whispers. Richard Sterling, seated in 1A, shifted uneasily. He tugged at his designer blazer, as though fabric could shield him from the inevitable. "Finally," he muttered, trying to summon his old confidence. "Good. Now escort me off this plane before this nonsense spreads any further." But the officers didn't even glance at him. Instead, they moved straight toward Danielle. One of them lowered his voice respectfully. "Ma'am, we've been briefed. Are you all right?" Danielle gave a small nod. "I'm fine, thank you." Passengers watched in awe. The respect, the recognition. It was a public affirmation that her dignity mattered, that the assault had not gone unseen or unacknowledged. Richard's jaw clenched. He stood abruptly, towering over the aisle. "Excuse me? Do you know who I am? I'm Richard Adam Sterling, CEO of Sterling Global. You don't address her before me." The lead officer turned slowly, his gaze steady, unshaken. "Yes, sir. We do know who you are, and that's exactly why we're here." The cabin erupted with quiet murmurs, some passengers stifling laughter, others shaking their heads in satisfaction. The billionaire's name, once a shield, had become a beacon for accountability. Richard's voice wavered between outrage and desperation. "This is a misunderstanding. She provoked me. I'll have your jobs for this." But the officers were unmoved. One read from a tablet. "Mr. Sterling, you are under investigation for assault and battery. You'll need to come with us immediately." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Passengers lifted their phones higher, recording every second. For Richard, humiliation was now global. He tried one last tactic, the language of wealth. "Listen, whatever you think you saw, it's exaggerated. I can fix this. Let's step outside. I'll make sure you're compensated for your trouble." The officer's response was sharp, cutting through the cabin like steel. "Sir, attempting to bribe law enforcement is a crime in itself. Sit down and cooperate." Richard froze. For a moment, the billionaire mask slipped completely, revealing what lay beneath. Fear. The same man who had strutted into the cabin demanding deference now stood trembling in the aisle, powerless. Two officers flanked him, their hands firm but not rough. As they guided him toward the exit, passengers erupted, not in chaos but in applause. It wasn't raucous, but steady, deliberate, The kind of applause given not to spectacle, but to justice. Richard flinched as the sound filled the cabin. He had always believed applause was his due, earned by his wealth and power. Now it marked his downfall. As he was led down the aisle, he passed Danielle. Their eyes met briefly, hers calm, his wild with panic. For the first time, he saw what the passengers had seen all along. He had struck not just a woman, not just a flight attendant, but a symbol of every worker, every black woman who had endured indignity in silence. And he had lost. Danielle did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply met his gaze with quiet strength, then turned back to her work. When the officers escorted him out the door, the cabin exhaled as one. The oppressive weight of arrogance had lifted. What remained was the memory of a collective stand, and the certainty that this time, silence had not protected the powerful. Richard Sterling left the plane not as a CEO, not as a mogul, but as a man in custody. His downfall had begun at 35,000 feet, and now it was grounded in reality. By dawn the next morning, Richard Sterling's face was everywhere. His mugshot, hastily taken in the airport police station, ran side by side with the now viral videos of the slap. Every news outlet, from cable giants to local stations, plastered the headline across screens. Billionaire CEO arrested after assaulting flight attendant in first class. Clips of the moment looped on every platform. The sharp sound of the slap, the stunned silence of the cabin, Danielle's poised response. It became the defining narrative of the day. Morning talk shows debated it with passion. Some framed it as a story of arrogance unchecked, while others dissected the deeper truth. The slap wasn't just about one man's rage. It was about the fragile line between power and accountability, about how often black women bore the brunt of disrespect and violence in silence. Social media raged with fury. Hashtags trended globally. #justice for Danielle, #Sterling downfall, #no more silence. Activists and cultural leaders spoke out. A prominent civil rights attorney tweeted, "Danielle represents every black woman who has been told to smile through humiliation, to endure what no one should endure. Her dignity exposes his brutality. This is bigger than one slap. It's a call to action." Meanwhile, Sterling Global, Richard's multi-billion-dollar company, scrambled. Board members held emergency meetings as stock prices tumbled overnight. Corporate sponsors issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves. Employees leaked internal emails, sharing stories of a toxic, abusive workplace culture that echoed what the world had now seen firsthand. On one network, an anchor put it bluntly, "This is not just a scandal. This is a mirror, and America is being forced to look at it." For Danielle, the attention was overwhelming. Overnight, she had gone from being a flight attendant, anonymous to most, just another uniformed figure moving gracefully through aisles, to a national symbol. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Messages flooded her phone, some supportive, others threatening. Her friends urged her to embrace the moment. "You have a platform now, use it," so one said. But Danielle hesitated. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She hadn't sought fame or recognition. All she had wanted was to do her job with dignity. Yet now the weight of expectation pressed down like never before. Still, she understood something vital. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was the story of every colleague who had been demeaned, every worker who had been silenced, every black woman who had been told to endure disrespect with a smile. Meanwhile, Richard tried to claw back his narrative. His lawyers released a statement claiming extreme stress had caused his momentary lapse of judgment. They attempted to paint him as a man under pressure, deserving of sympathy. But the public wasn't buying it. Stress didn't excuse a slap. Wealth didn't erase accountability. And the footage of Danielle's calm composure against his violent arrogance told the story more clearly than any lawyer ever could. Late-night comedians seized on the scandal. One joked, "Turns out turbulence wasn't the scariest thing on Flight 781. It was sitting next to Richard Sterling." Laughter rippled across audiences. But beneath the humor was a truth that no one could deny. The billionaire's reputation had been reduced to a punchline. What stung Richard most wasn't just the arrest or the headlines. It was the loss of fear. For years, his wealth had been his weapon, silencing critics, intimidating employees, bending rules. But now, ordinary passengers, strangers on a flight, had exposed him, and the world had chosen to believe them, not him. Danielle, on the other hand, was beginning to realize her quiet defiance had sparked something larger. She hadn't shouted or fought back, but her refusal to be broken had ignited a movement. The fallout was no longer just about one man's disgrace. It was about what came next. For days after the incident, Danielle stayed quiet. She returned home, avoided reporters, and leaned on close friends and family. To the outside world, her silence felt heavy. Was she scared? Overwhelmed? Broken by the weight of global attention? But Danielle wasn't silent out of fear. She was waiting. Waiting until she could gather her strength, until she was ready to speak on her own terms. Not as a headline or a viral video, but as a woman with a story that demanded to be told. That moment came when she agreed to sit down for an exclusive interview. The studio was small, intimate, with soft lighting that cast her not as a victim, but as a woman in control. Across from her sat a seasoned journalist known for asking hard questions with compassion. The first words Danielle spoke were simple but powerful. I didn't slap back, not because I couldn't, but because I shouldn't have to. The room went still. Viewers across the country leaned in closer. She wasn't speaking just about a single night on a flight. She was speaking about the endless expectation that Black women must endure mistreatment silently, gracefully, without resistance, or risk being labeled angry, aggressive, or unprofessional. People ask me why I stayed calm, she continued. But do you know how many times women like me have had no choice? Do you know how many times we've had to swallow our pain, smile through our humiliation? Because the world tells us it's safer that way. Her voice didn't waver. Each word landed with the weight of lived truth. She spoke of her childhood, raised by a mother who taught her that dignity was a shield no one could take from her. She spoke of the countless times passengers had spoken down to her, assuming she was less because she wore a uniform. She spoke of the sting of being doubted, dismissed, or treated as invisible. And then she spoke of Richard Sterling. He thought his money gave him power over me. He thought one slap could reduce me. But dignity isn't something you can buy, and respect isn't something you can slap away. The interview cut to silence for a moment. No interruptions, no commentary. Just her words echoing in the minds of millions watching. By the time she finished, Danielle had shifted the narrative. She was no longer the silent figure in the viral video. She was a voice, strong, steady, undeniable. Her words resonated across social media, replayed in classrooms, boardrooms, and protests. Activists praised her courage. Civil rights leaders called her testimony a modern echo of voices silenced too long. Ordinary workers, nurses, teachers, service staff shared their own stories online, tagging them #DignityAtWork, inspired by Danielle's strength. Richard's camp, meanwhile, scrambled to respond. His lawyers dismissed her words as overdramatic and insisted he was being vilified unfairly. But every attempt to minimize her story only deepened public disdain. One commentator on national TV summed it up. Sterling had money, power, and influence, but Danielle had truth, and in the end, truth is louder. For Danielle, the sudden role of symbol was still overwhelming. She admitted as much in the interview. I never wanted to be the face of anything, she said softly, but if my story means one less woman has to endure humiliation in silence, then it's worth it. Her humility only made her message stronger. She wasn't positioning herself as a martyr or a hero. She was simply a woman demanding the basic respect that should have been hers all along. And in a world where arrogance and violence so often went unchecked, her quiet strength became revolutionary. By the time the interview ended, Danielle had done more than tell her story. She had given a voice to millions who had been waiting for someone, anyone, to say aloud what they had always known, that dignity cannot be bought, silenced, or struck down. Richard Sterling had built his empire on intimidation. Boardrooms bent to his will, employees endured his temper, and politicians courted his donations. For decades he had lived by one rule: money solves everything. But in the days following Flight 781, Richard discovered a brutal truth. There are some wounds money can't heal, some stories wealth can't erase. The first cracks appeared on Wall Street. Sterling Global's stock plummeted, wiping billions from its market value in less than 72 hours. Shareholders demanded answers. Board members, once loyal to Richard's iron grip, now whispered in private about replacing him. His empire was bleeding, and the world smelled it. Next came the sponsors. Major corporations pulled contracts citing zero tolerance for violence and discrimination. Conference organizers canceled speaking events. Charities announced they would no longer accept his donations, unwilling to stain their causes with his name. Overnight, Richard went from keynote guest to persona non grata. The media firestorm only deepened the wounds. Editorials framed him as the symbol of unchecked power, the face of arrogance crumbling under accountability. Late-night hosts roasted him nightly, and memes flooded the internet, mocking him as the man who thought he was above a seatbelt. But the most devastating blows came from within his own company. Former employees began speaking out, emboldened by Danielle's story. Anonymous forums filled with accounts of verbal abuse, discrimination, and threats from Richard himself. One ex-executive went public on national television. Richard didn't just slap a flight attendant. He slapped every employee who ever dared to stand up to him. Lawsuits followed. Civil suits piled up alongside the criminal charges already filed for assault and battery. Lawyers circled like sharks, sensing the blood in the water. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling was not untouchable. He was vulnerable. His friends in high places began to vanish too. Politicians returned campaign donations. Celebrities distanced themselves. Invitations to exclusive galas and fundraisers dried up. The man who once commanded rooms with wealth and charisma now found himself isolated, avoided, whispered about. At home, the collapse was even more personal. Family members who had tolerated his arrogance out of convenience turned cold. His wife, long silent about his temper, filed for separation. His children refused his calls, ashamed of the headlines. Richard, once surrounded by sycophants and admirers, was suddenly painfully alone. And through it all, Danielle's face was everywhere, not as a victim, but as a figure of strength. Interviews replayed her words, activists invoked her name, and workers across industries used her story to demand respect in their own workplaces. Each time her story was told, Richard's name was dragged lower. What stung most wasn't just the loss of money or status. It was the loss of fear. For years, Richard had relied on the silence of others, employees, rivals, even strangers. But Flight 781 had changed the equation. Passengers had spoken, the world had listened, and silence no longer protected him. Sitting in his penthouse one evening, watching his empire unravel on the news, Richard muttered bitterly to himself, "One slap, one stupid slap." But it wasn't just one slap. It was decades of arrogance, years of unchecked abuse, concentrated into a single moment the world could no longer ignore. The slap was just the spark. The fire had been waiting all along. By the end of the week, the Sterling Global Board voted to suspend him as CEO. The empire he had built was still standing, but Richard himself had been exiled from it. Once a titan of industry, he was now the cautionary tale. And somewhere, Danielle was quietly boarding another flight, putting on her uniform and walking down the aisle with the same dignity as before. The world had changed around her, but she remained herself. For Richard Sterling, however, the world he had once owned was gone. His empire was in ruins, and he had no one to blame but himself. For most people, the events of Flight 781 might have been just another shocking headline, a viral story, a corporate scandal, a billionaire's downfall. But for Danielle and for millions of black men and women watching around the world, it became something much bigger. It became a spark. The slap was not just about Richard Sterling losing control. It was about every moment a black worker had been talked down to, every time a flight attendant's authority had been ignored, every instance where dignity was stripped away in the name of power. Within days, Danielle's story became a rallying cry. Social media brimmed with hashtags like #RespectTheCrew and #DignityInTheSky. But it wasn't only about flight attendants anymore. Teachers, nurses, hotel staff, and service workers everywhere began sharing their own stories of humiliation and discrimination, using Danielle's experience as a mirror to reflect their own struggles. Unions took notice. At a national aviation summit, Danielle's name was invoked repeatedly. She wasn't just standing up for herself, one labor leader declared. She stood up for all of us. Strikes and walkouts gained new momentum, with workers demanding stricter protections against harassment and abuse in the workplace. What made Danielle's story resonate wasn't just the slap, it was her composure in the face of cruelty. She didn't shout, she didn't retaliate, she didn't let Richard Sterling strip away her dignity, and that quiet strength became the heart of the movement. Churches, community centers, and activist groups across the country invited her to speak. At first, she hesitated. "I'm just a flight attendant," she told them. But the crowd's response was always the same. "No, you're a voice." And as Danielle began to share her story publicly, she realized that her pain had purpose. She spoke not only about the assault, but about the daily realities of racism, the subtle insults, the patronizing tone, the way some passengers assumed her job meant she was invisible. What happened on that flight wasn't new, she told audiences. The only new thing was that the world finally saw it. The response was overwhelming. People wept during her speeches. Workers in other industries said they felt seen for the first time. Parents brought their children, telling them, "This is what dignity looks like." Even passengers from Flight 781 began joining the conversation. Some wrote op-eds describing the shock of witnessing the slap, admitting that before that moment, they had never really thought about the treatment of flight attendants. One passenger even confessed, "I realized I've been guilty of dismissing them too." That changes today. The ripple effect stretched beyond borders. International unions expressed solidarity. A European airline announced mandatory anti-discrimination training for all staff. In South Africa, a journalist wrote, "This story is not just America's. It is ours too. Power must be accountable everywhere." For Danielle, each step forward was bittersweet. She had never asked to be a symbol. She wanted to serve passengers, to love her work, to see the world. But as she watched the movement grow, she understood something deeper. Her struggle was part of a much larger fight, one that stretched back generations. Her grandmother, who had marched during the civil rights era, called her late one night. "Baby," she said softly, "we carried the torch as far as we could. Now it's in your hands." And Danielle wept, not out of sadness, but out of recognition. She wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was part of a legacy, one voice in a chorus that refused to be silenced. The slap had started a storm, but what rose from it was not chaos. It was a movement. One flight, one moment, had awakened something far bigger than Richard Sterling's arrogance. It had awakened resistance. Danielle never imagined herself standing on a stage, addressing thousands. She had always been the quiet one, the one who listened more than she spoke. Her job had been about service, making others comfortable, anticipating needs, keeping peace in a cabin thousands of feet above the earth. But silence had been forced on her for too long, and now she had realized it was time to speak. She appeared at a televised town hall on racial justice and workplace dignity. The host introduced her simply, a flight attendant who stood tall at 35,000 feet. When she stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. Danielle stood at the podium, nervous at first, her hands trembling slightly. Then she began. "I wasn't just slapped on that plane. I was told that my dignity didn't matter, that my blackness didn't matter, that my role, my humanity, could be dismissed with a hand. But I want to tell you all something. Our dignity is not negotiable." The room went silent. Cameras zoomed in, and for the first time, Danielle's voice carried far beyond the aisles of an aircraft. It carried into living rooms, schools, and boardrooms across the country. After the town hall, invitations poured in. Universities asked her to speak to students about resilience. Labor unions wanted her to headline rallies. Even international organizations called, inviting her to address conferences on equality and workers' rights. Each time she stood before an audience, her words grew stronger, steadier. She began to share not only her story, but the stories of others who reached out to her. Teachers insulted by parents, nurses demeaned by patients, hotel workers ignored by guests. Danielle's speeches became a tapestry of voices, a reminder that her slap was never just about her. What made her different from politicians or activists was authenticity. She wasn't rehearsed. She wasn't polished. She spoke like someone who had lived it. "I'm not a leader," she often said. "I'm a worker, just like you. I put on my uniform, I do my job, and I demand respect." Audiences believed her because they saw themselves in her. And slowly Danielle realized she was becoming a leader. Not because she sought the role, but because people needed her in it. Her growing platform also attracted critics. Some accused her of seeking fame, of profiting from tragedy. Anonymous voices online told her to get over it. Others claimed she exaggerated what happened, but Danielle never wavered. Each time she faced attacks, she responded with the same calm strength she had shown on the plane. If telling the truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe the truth is overdue. Behind the spotlight, she struggled too. Public life weighed heavily. Some nights she sat alone in her apartment, overwhelmed, questioning whether she was strong enough to carry the burden. But she leaned on her family, her co-workers, and the very movement she had inspired. "You don't have to carry it alone," her best friend told her. "We're carrying it with you." And so she pressed forward. Months after the slap, Danielle published an op-ed in a national newspaper titled, "Dignity is Non-Negotiable." The piece went viral, reprinted across the globe, translated into multiple languages. In it, she wrote, "When I was struck in that cabin, I didn't just feel my cheek burn. I felt the weight of every black worker who has ever been told to stay quiet, to take it, to keep smiling no matter the abuse. But silence has never protected us. Speaking truth, even when it shakes the room, is how we claim our dignity." The op-ed solidified her role as not just a survivor, but a voice. From silence, she had risen to power. Not the power of money or influence, but the power of truth. And unlike Richard Sterling's empire, this was a power no one could strip away. Months had passed since that flight, yet the echo of Richard Sterling's slap still reverberated, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what dignity demanded. Danielle had returned to work. Many were surprised by her decision. Some thought she would leave aviation behind for activism full-time. But for Danielle, the cabin had always been more than a job. It was a place where she met people from every walk of life, where she held together small communities in the sky. Returning to those aisles was her way of proving that no billionaire, no slap could take her passion away. Her uniform fit differently now, not physically, but symbolically. When she walked down the aisle, passengers looked at her with new eyes. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered thank yous. A few even admitted, "I saw your story. Because of you, I speak up more at work now." Every flight became more than service. It became testimony. Quietly, without speeches or cameras, Danielle showed that dignity wasn't an abstract idea. It was lived daily in how she carried herself and how she treated others. At the same time, the movement she helped ignite continued to grow. Airlines introduced stricter codes of conduct for passengers, protecting crew members from harassment. Unions negotiated stronger workplace protections. Laws were debated in Congress about accountability for in-flight violence. What began in one cabin now reshaped the skies across the nation. But Danielle's legacy wasn't just institutional, it was deeply personal. In schools, children wrote essays about her story. Teachers used her experience to spark conversations about respect and race. Parents told their kids, "If you ever feel small, remember the flight attendant who stood tall." Her grandmother's words, "We carried the torch as far as we could," echoed often in her heart. Danielle saw herself as part of a long line, not the beginning or the end, but one voice in an ongoing struggle. "I didn't change the world," she often reminded interviewers. The world changed because so many of us refused to stay silent. As for Richard Sterling, his empire lay in ruins. Exiled from his company, abandoned by allies, his name had become a cautionary tale taught in business schools about arrogance and accountability. His fall was complete, not because Danielle sought revenge, but because truth had a way of standing when empires collapsed. The final irony was that his slap, meant to humiliate and silence, had instead elevated Danielle's voice beyond anything she could have imagined. His power had crumbled, while hers had multiplied, not in wealth, but in meaning. One evening on a quiet layover, Danielle sat by her hotel window overlooking the city lights. She thought of the long journey, from the sting on her cheek to the stages, the interviews, the rallies, and back to the calm routine of flights. She realized something profound. The slap had not defined her. Her response had. And that response, the calm, steady refusal to surrender her dignity, was now her legacy. She whispered softly to herself, almost as if sending a message to every worker, every person who had ever been belittled. Hey, they can try to strip us down. They can try to silence us. But dignity is ours, and when we stand in it, we rise. Danielle smiled, knowing that tomorrow she would board another flight, greet another set of passengers, and walk the aisle with quiet strength. The movement would continue, the struggle would continue, but so too would the dignity. A new chapter had begun, not just for her, but for all who believe that respect is non-negotiable. And so the legacy of one moment in first class at 35,000 feet lived on, not as a story of a slap, but as a story of resistance, dignity, and the unstoppable power of truth.